Hi friends, I'm Hank Smith, and today we're going to learn in a two-part series how to think pianistically with our banjos. What does that mean? Basically that means that we're going to think about the banjo as though it was a piano and learn in this particular lesson how to split chord inversions. Basically we're going to take one chord and split it in half and spread it out over the fretboard. You can use this in improvising, you can use it in composing, you can use it for a variety of things, and it's a lot of fun. The first thing we need to know is how to use these chords and split them in half. So there's a couple ways you can do this. You can ascend by octave or by step diatonically. We're going to use the D major chord as our first example in this octave or inversion and this octave or inversion, and we're going to split them in half. The notes in a D chord are D, F sharp, A. We're going to use the first string as a pivot point to repeat the cycle up here. F sharp, A, and D. So D, F sharp, A, D, open string pivot point, F sharp, A, D. And then we'll go back, using the open string as the point at which you shift. So all together, if I wanted to play D minor, it would be D, F, A, D, F, A, D. Same thing. So what you do on one end, you do to the other. And that allows you to split everything in half and get the most coverage from one end to the fretboard to the other. Now, the other rule that we have with this is to ascend by step. What does that mean? So the next step, diatonically in the D, is E minor. Ascending from there, F sharp minor, and so on and so forth. We're really only going to concern ourselves with the first one or two steps up. So what I do on one end, I'm going to play a D on the low end of this, and then switch to E minor up here. The next E minor above this D is here. So we'll start with D, D, F sharp, A, D, shift, G, B, E for our E minor triad. So we went, and we can come back down to D, or we can keep going up the diatonic scale and hit F sharp minor the next time around. So if we start with D, and then come back, let's say E minor, we just shifted between D major and E minor. It's the same as doing this. Or, except we split it. But if we keep going up the diatonic scale, the next one in sequence would be F sharp minor. So instead of playing the E minor back here in the low end, we're going to switch to F sharp minor. So we will have covered 3 chords in the span of one sweep. Which is a real nice sound. So to recap, here we have D, E minor, F sharp minor. Of course that F sharp minor has a D in it because that is our pivot string. So we just learned how to do that on the outside string, the first string. The outside strings are the pivot strings. They make it the easiest because you can incorporate that into a natural roll pattern. So we're going to try to use the 5th string as the pivot point this time around, and the chord example that we'll use for this is going to be an A flat major 7, which is a beautiful sounding chord with the open G string. So to recap, A flat major 7, here is A. In first position, we move it back a half step to A flat. In order for it to be an A flat major 7, it has to have a G major in it, and so we're going to play that G major with the open string, which again, beautiful sounding chord. And so same rule applies as before with the D. We're going to use the G string as the pivot point and shift up to our next octave, which is going to be up here. And remember, whatever you do to one end, you have to do to the other. So it can be a little stretchy to get to this G to play the A flat major 7. So do the best you can with that. But here we go. So every time I shifted was where the open G string was. And so if we do the same thing we did before, that was going up by octave, where we go up by step, the next diatonic neighbor to A flat major 7 is B flat minor 7, which is another beautiful sounding chord. So we're going to ascend here, pivot on the open G string, and then play the B flat minor 7 chord. So you see we went from here and then back. And you can do the same pattern that we did with D and keep going up. If you were to go up by octave, remember what you do on one end, you have to do on the other. And if you go up by step, then you just hit the next diatonic neighbor up when you ascend after you shifted on the open string. So we learned how to do it with the pivot point on the first string and the pivot point on the fifth string. What happens if we get to the inside strings? Well, things get a little bit trickier there because you have to be more careful with your chord choice. But I'll give you the E major, where we use the B string as our pivot point. And so you can, again, we're going up by octave the first time. So you can pick your next E major to be here at the bar shape at the 9th fret, or if you need to do something different, you can play it here. This inversion of E is the same as this. So it just depends on your choices on what happens next after that, where you need to be on the neck, etc., etc. So again, we're using the same thing. Here's our pivot point. Pretty straightforward. Or if we go up to the next one, same idea, only this time the second string is the pivot point. So I leave it up to you, the viewer, to figure out where you can use this and this as your open pivots. Keep experimenting with it because it's a lot of fun to play around with. And the main rule to keep in mind is that you don't play the same note in the same octave. In other words, you wouldn't do this. So this B and this B are the same note in the same octave. You don't want to repeat the note in the same way. But you can do this. So in that one I went up to the next highest G just to round it out. So what you do to one, you do to the other. If I wanted that to be an E7, then we have to add the D to it because that's the dominant 7. But the trick there is that if you do that with the E7, you're actually making this one the pivot note. It's back to being that, unless of course you did. But then that gets rid of the idea of the open pivot note. So again, this is all up to you guys to figure out. And I think if you play around with it enough, you'll find that it can be a very efficient way to move up and down the neck and change chords in such a way that gives you kind of a bigger keyboard sort of pianistic way to think about the banjo. And in part 2 of this series, we'll learn how to get even more bang for your buck out of this and cascade those inversions, meaning that they will roll across the keyboard, or the fretboard in our case, in a very satisfying way. As for the D and G strings, I'm going to let you guys figure out the best ways to pivot off of those open strings in the middle, and I encourage you to experiment freely with it. It's a lot of fun to play with, and if you can kind of wrap your head around thinking about the banjo as though it were acting like a piano, you can get these big sweeping chord inversions. So, have a good time and happy picking!